Welcome to True Echo, where real voices meet unforgettable stories. Today's powerful tale begins on a foggy morning, where the past, present, and future collide. A man pulled over by police. Documents burned. A brutal beating. But here's what they didn't know: he was the newly elected mayor. What happens next will shake an entire city to its core. Stay with us as we uncover the truth they tried to bury. The morning in Glenridge began like any other, foggy, hushed, and slow to wake. By 6:15 a.m., the city streets were blanketed in a wet stillness, the kind that made every sound feel amplified and every movement seem meaningful. On Riverton Road, an old black Crown Victoria cruised quietly through the mist, engine steady, as if it understood it was carrying more than a man, it carried a mission decades in the making. Behind the wheel sat Calvin Booker, 52 years old, black, and newly elected as the first black mayor in Glenridge history. There was no police escort, no cameras, no staff. Just him, his thoughts, and a folded speech-writing shotgun, one he wasn't nervous about. What Calvin Booker had seen in his lifetime made stage fright feel like a luxury. Raised on the East Side, son of a sanitation worker and a seamstress, Calvin had worked his way from janitor to professor to city councilman, all without losing the rhythm of his roots. As he turned onto Riverfront Boulevard, a static buzz crackled through the jazz station playing softly in the background. He reached to silence it, and that's when he saw it. A police cruiser ahead, swerving erratically across lanes. No sirens. No urgency. Just recklessness. Calvin's jaw tightened. This wasn't just dangerous, it was disrespectful. He flashed his lights once. Then again. The cruiser didn't respond. Finally, a third time. Still nothing. He pulled his official badge from his coat pocket and set it on the dash, embossed with Glenridge's seal. This wasn't about pulling rank, it was about doing the job he was elected to do. He pressed the gas gently, closing the distance, and watched as the cruiser finally drifted toward the shoulder of the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Calvin followed and parked a few feet behind. The fog peeled back just enough to reveal the chipped bricks of an old gas station, a broken neon sign flickering above. He stepped out, calm but alert. This wasn't fear, it was preparation. As a black man in America, you learned early that the difference between dignity and danger was often decided in less than 5 seconds. From the patrol car, 2 white officers emerged. The first was skinny, young, sharp-jawed, his mirrored sunglasses ridiculous in the fog. The second was older, bulkier, with arms like cinder blocks and a smirk that said he'd already decided who Calvin was before the conversation even started. "Good morning," Calvin said firmly, hands visible. "I noticed some erratic driving. I need to see your badge numbers." The skinny one let out a laugh and strutted closer. "What, you pulling us over now? You got a whistle too?" Calvin didn't flinch. "I'm Mayor Calvin Booker. Today's my first day in office. I'm asking you to identify yourselves, officers." The big one snorted and snatched the leather badge holder from Calvin's hand. A moment of silence. Then a flick. A lighter sparked beneath the badge. Plastic bubbled, and the seal of Glenridge curled into ash. "You just destroyed official city property," Calvin said, voice low. "That's a felony." "Felony, huh?" the skinny one sneered. "You talk like someone who thinks we care." Before Calvin could move, they were on him. A shove to the chest. A baton to the ribs. A punch to the gut. He dropped to one knee, gasping, his breath knocked from his body but not his spirit. He staggered to his feet, coat torn, mouth bleeding. He didn't plead. Instead, he shoved back with both hands, surprising the big one enough to send him stumbling. Then, Calvin dove into his car, slammed the door, locked it, and grabbed the emergency mic beneath the dash. "This is Mayor Calvin Booker. Badge 2075. Under assault by Glenridge PD, Code Black. Emergency response requested." The next sound he heard wasn't laughter. It was sirens, his sirens. The sirens sliced through the fog like a blade, growing louder with each passing second. From inside the locked car, Calvin watched as the two officers, Collins, the skinny one, and Reddick, the bulkier, froze like statues caught mid-predator stalk. The glint of arrogance left Collins's face first. His hand dropped from the car window, replaced now by something closer to panic. Calvin's fingers gripped the mic tightly, his other hand trembling against the steering wheel. His body ached, ribs bruised, lip cracked, his side throbbing from the baton, but his mind remained razor sharp. He knew what was coming. He just didn't know if it would be in time. The sirens crescendoed. Then came the flashing lights, red and blue slashing through the gray fog. Not one, not two, but 4 vehicles descended onto the scene. A black SUV with tinted windows screeched to a halt beside Calvin's Crown Victoria. The back door opened fast, purposefully, and out stepped Lieutenant Rivera, head of Glenridge's Emergency Response Unit. His trench coat flapped in the wind, gold badge swinging from his neck. He raised one hand and barked, "Step away from that vehicle. Hands where I can see them." Collins and Reddick backed up instantly. Gone was the mockery, the dismissive swagger. Reddick mumbled something inaudible, eyes darting between the approaching officers and the flashing lights. Collins stammered. Wait, this isn't what it looks like." Rivera didn't even blink. "What it looks like," he snapped, "is you assaulted the mayor of Glenridge on his first day in office. Cuff them. Now." As uniformed officers swarmed the scene, Calvin finally exhaled. His muscles eased just enough to allow pain to register fully. EMTs approached, one of them gently tapping on his window. "Mr. Mayor. We need to assess you." He unlocked the door, and as they helped him out, his legs wobbled but held. The fog had nearly cleared now, but in its place came cameras, phones held aloft by early morning commuters, gas station employees, and one barista from the nearby cafe who had filmed the entire beating. Within the hour, that video would go viral. But for now, Calvin stood silently as the EMT cleaned his busted lip, checking for fractures. Across the street, Collins and Reddick sat in handcuffs, still mouthing off through the grating of the squad car. "This is bull," Collins hissed. "We didn't even hit him that hard." Calvin heard it. He didn't react. Lieutenant Rivera approached, shoulders tight with tension. "Sir, we're going to take care of this. Internal Affairs is already on the way." Bodycams were off, but that footage, he nodded toward the bystander, that's all the city needs. Calvin didn't look away from the squad car. His voice, when it came, was low but sharp. "They didn't ask for my name. They didn't ask why I pulled them over. They saw a black man with authority, and that was enough." Rivera's jaw clenched. "It won't go unpunished. Not this time." As Calvin was helped into the ambulance, the city around them began to awaken in a different way. Within minutes, the bystanders' video had hit social media, "Mayor beaten by Glenridge police." The caption was raw, the footage worse. The comments section exploded, pain, rage, disbelief. Local stations broke their morning news to cover the unfolding scandal. By the time Calvin arrived at Glenridge General Hospital, his name wasn't just trending. It was roaring. Reporters crowded outside the ER entrance, police scanners filled with chatter, and within City Hall, barely 10 blocks away, the phones were ringing off the hook. The chief of police, Gregory Holloway, watched the footage in silence, his hands shaking as he slammed the laptop closed. "We have a goddamn firestorm," he muttered. But that was only the beginning. Inside the sterile walls of Glenridge General, Calvin Booker lay on a gurney, his coat folded beside him, the remnants of his melted ID badge tucked into a plastic evidence bag. A nurse gently dabbed antiseptic over the gash near his brow. Despite the quiet hum of machines and murmurs of hospital staff, the world outside had erupted. By 9 a.m., every major news outlet in the region had picked up the story. The footage, raw, unedited, and devastating, looped across every screen. In the break room of a factory, in the lobby of a law firm, in the waiting room of a pediatric clinic, everywhere, people watched the same horrific scene unfold, a black man beaten by cops, his credentials mocked and burned, only for the world to find out he was the mayor. In a city long plagued by whispered accusations of racial profiling, excessive force, and corruption, this wasn't just scandal. It was a reckoning. Back in his hospital room, Calvin sat upright, for in his arm, tablet on his lap. He had not yet spoken publicly. No statements, no tweets, no interviews. But he read every message that poured into his inbox, hundreds within the first few hours. Some were from old college friends. Some from strangers. But the most powerful ones were short. Raw. That could have been my son. I'm so sorry this happened to you, Mr. Mayor, again. We see you. We've been you. Across Glenridge, protests bloomed without a single leader calling for them. People didn't wait for permission. By midday, City Hall's front steps were packed shoulder to shoulder with citizens holding signs. Protect us from the protectors. He's the mayor. What about the rest of us? Justice for Calvin. Justice for Glenridge. And in the center stood Rosa Daniels, a retired teacher who once taught Calvin in 3rd grade. Her voice, raspy with age but clear with purpose, cut through the crowd. This isn't just about what they did to Calvin. It's about what they thought they could get away with. It's about how many times we've watched this and said, nothing will change. Well, we're done saying that. Across town, inside a conference room where wood-paneled walls tried to mute the chaos outside, Chief Holloway faced a half-dozen department heads, each one pale and frantic. This is a PR nightmare, one whispered. It's not PR, Holloway snapped. It's a human rights disaster. He stood slowly, each syllable deliberate. We're suspending both officers without pay, effective immediately. And we're launching a full internal investigation. But that's not going to save us. What will? Another asked. Holloway looked down at the table, then out the window toward City Hall. Only he can. And that afternoon, against his doctor's advice, Calvin stood, dressed, and walked out the front doors of the hospital. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't smile for the cameras. He went straight to City Hall, climbed the marble steps through the sea of supporters, placed a hand on the bronze door, and walked inside to do the job he had sworn to perform, now carrying not just the city's hopes, but its raw, rattled truth. He wasn't just Glenridge's first black mayor anymore. He was its mirror. The Glenridge courtroom was packed tighter than a church on Easter Sunday. Cameramen elbowed for angles, reporters clutched notepads, and locals who had never set foot inside a courtroom now stood in silent rows, their eyes fixed forward. No one wanted to miss what was about to happen. Calvin Booker sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a navy suit, not flashy, not new, but deliberate. The bruising under his right eye had faded into a sickly yellow-green, a silent testament to what had occurred. He sat with his spine straight and chin level, as if being broken had never been an option. Across from him, Officers Collins and Reddick wore cheap suits and stiff expressions, flanked by their attorney, a polished man with 2 white teeth who kept smoothing his tie every time the room got quiet. The murmurs died down when the judge entered. With a sharp rap of the gavel, the trial officially began. It didn't take long for the defense to try spinning the narrative. This was a case of confusion, the lawyer said, with a voice that sounded rehearsed. My clients believed Mr. Booker was impersonating an official, a serious crime. What followed was an unfortunate escalation. Unfortunate escalation. That phrase alone nearly caused the entire courtroom to erupt. But Calvin didn't flinch. He waited. And when the prosecution took the floor, everything shifted. Permission to play Exhibit A, the prosecutor said. The lights dimmed. The screen lit up. And then came the raw footage. Calvin stepping out of his car, calmly identifying himself. Collins mocking him. Reddick snatching the badge. The lighter flicking open. Laughter. Then the punch. The baton. The slurs. The final desperate crawl back to his vehicle. No narration. No commentary. Just evidence. When the video ended, the silence was suffocating. Calvin stood slowly. All eyes on him. His voice was calm, measured. I didn't pull them over as a show of authority. I did it because they were endangering drivers. That's my job, keeping this city safe. But the moment they saw me, none of that mattered. Because to them, I didn't look like a mayor. I looked like a problem. He glanced at the jury. They didn't ask questions. They assumed. And their assumptions came with fists. When cross-examined, the defense attorney tried a different tactic. Mr. Booker, would you say your tone could have been interpreted as confrontational? Calvin leaned forward slightly. Is accountability confrontational to you, counselor? Or just when it comes from someone who looks like me? That moment hit like a stone skipping across still water. The jury sat forward. Even the judge didn't hide his reaction. Then came a twist no one expected. On the second day of the trial, Officer Reddick took the stand. Sweating beneath the courtroom lights, he stammered through the oath, sat down, and began his testimony. He tried to hold the line at first, claimed he thought Calvin was dangerous, that he feared for his safety. But then the prosecutor leaned in. Officer Reddick, isn't it true that during morning briefings, Glenridge PD is routinely advised to watch for undesirable types in certain neighborhoods? Reddick hesitated. Blinked. Looked at his attorney. Then back at the prosecutor. Yes, he finally said, his voice barely audible. Could you clarify what you mean by undesirable? A pause. Then, with a shaky breath, Reddick spoke the truth. They mean black men. Mostly. Sometimes Latinos. Anyone who doesn't fit the area. We're told to be extra cautious. A gasp rippled through the room. And just like that, it wasn't just about two bad cops anymore. It was about the system. The prosecutor turned toward the judge. Your Honor, in light of this testimony, the prosecution formally requests a judicial inquiry into Glenridge PD's briefing protocols, racial bias patterns, and internal complaint investigations for the past 10 years. The judge's face was pale, but resolute. Granted. The gavel struck like thunder. And the crowd outside, watching on screens through courtroom windows and cell phones, erupted into cheers. Inside, Calvin sat silently, his hands folded, heart pounding, not from victory, but from the weight of a city's first real crack in the wall of silence. The news spread through Glenridge like wildfire. A courtroom admission from a police officer that racial profiling was baked into the department's daily operations, caught live on camera, broadcast across every major network, and played on every local radio station. People didn't just talk. They marched. By the next morning, Glenridge's streets weren't just filled with outrage, they were filled with movement. Not riots. Not chaos. Purpose. High school students walked out of class. Small business owners closed shop for the day. Even a few city employees, quiet ones who had whispered support in corners before, now joined the crowds outside City Hall with signs that read, "Fix the system, or step aside. If this happened to the mayor, what about us? Reform isn't enough. Rebuild." But inside those tall government walls, Calvin Booker sat in a different kind of storm. His inbox overflowed with messages, some hopeful, some hateful. Some accused him of overreacting, of turning a misunderstanding into a public circus. Others praised him for having the strength to keep fighting when most would have resigned. He didn't respond to any of them, not yet. Instead, he turned his focus inward, deep into the cracks of Glenridge's police policies. With the help of Lieutenant Rivera and a team of pro bono civil rights lawyers from the state capitol, Calvin launched a sweeping audit of the Glenridge Police Department. What they found wasn't just troubling. It was damning. Over a decade of uninvestigated complaints. Dozens of excessive force reports that ended with the same copy-pasted resolution, no wrongdoing found. Disciplinary files mysteriously empty. Internal reviews never completed. More than 80% of traffic stops in wealthier neighborhoods had targeted black or brown drivers. Even worse, many of those stops lacked probable cause documentation. They weren't random. They were routine. Calvin gathered all of it. Then, 3 days after Reddick's testimony, he called a press conference. The crowd outside Glenridge City Hall swelled beyond the steps, spilling into the surrounding streets. Media trucks lined the block. Helicopters hovered overhead. People came not just for words, they came for change. Calvin stepped up to the podium, wearing the same suit he'd worn on his inauguration day. No tie. No teleprompter. He didn't need one. I was sworn in, he began, to serve Glenridge with truth, fairness, and courage. Those 3 words were mocked, spit on, and stomped into the gravel by 2 officers who thought a badge made them untouchable. But this isn't just about them. This is about a system that trained them to believe that. The crowd was silent, listening, not watching. He continued. This week, we uncovered a decade of cover-ups. Racist policies. Willful neglect. And silence. Lots and lots of silence. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Well, the silence is over. Then came the bombshell. Effective immediately, I am ordering a full restructuring of the Glenridge Police Department. Every training session will be filmed and open to civilian review. Every officer will be recertified under new accountability standards. And any law enforcement member who shows a pattern of racial bias, documented or otherwise, will be stripped of their badge. The crowd gasped, then roared. Calvin raised a hand, not to silence, but to steady. There are those who will call this a purge. Let them. I call it a beginning. The cameras flashed. The networks broadcast every second. But it was the people who carried the moment forward. Chants rose, not just of Calvin's name, but of change, of justice, of hope. Protesters became organizers. Residents volunteered to serve on the new Civilian Oversight Board Calvin announced that same afternoon. And down the street, in neighborhoods that had long felt forgotten, front porches lit up with conversations that hadn't been spoken in years. For the first time, Glenridge felt like a city waking up, not to rage, but to responsibility. Yet inside a holding cell downtown, Officers Collins and Reddick stewed in disbelief. I can't believe this crap, Collins muttered, pacing the length of the concrete floor. Reddick sat on the bench, jaw clenched. All this, over a scuffle. Collins snorted. This ain't justice. It's a witch hunt. But they weren't the ones in charge anymore. Because justice wasn't just coming. It was already here. The courtroom was packed again, but this time, the mood was different. There was no curiosity now, only expectation. People came not for spectacle, but for resolution. The trial had concluded. The verdict had been read, guilty, on multiple counts. Assault. Destruction of official property. Abuse of power. And, most damningly, willful misconduct under color of authority. Officers Collins and Reddick sat in orange jumpsuits now, not tailored suits. Their hands were cuffed in front of them, heads lowered. There were no more smirks. No more smart remarks. Just silence. And anticipation. Judge Morales cleared his throat, preparing to sentence. But first, he turned toward the victim, Mayor Calvin Booker, and asked the question the city had waited to hear. Would you like to make a final statement before sentencing is rendered? Calvin stood, slowly and without hesitation. He walked to the front of the courtroom, looked past the judge, past the cameras, and locked eyes, first with Collins, then Reddick. "I'm not here today to call for vengeance," he said, voice calm but unshakable. "I'm here to remind this city what justice actually looks like." He turned toward the judge, then back to the officers. "You didn't just fail to recognize my authority that day. You failed to recognize my humanity. You burned my ID, but you didn't stop there. You tried to burn the idea that a black man could ever belong in power without having to beg for it." Collins looked away. Reddick held his gaze, but said nothing. "And while you might think this is just about you, it's not," Calvin continued. "It's about every person who's been pulled over for looking like me. Every child who watched that video and saw their future in my bruises." He took a breath, steadying his words. "I don't need to see you rot in a cell to feel peace. What I want is for this to mark the beginning of something none of you ever expected: accountability." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge nodded slowly, as if to acknowledge that no sentencing could match the power of what had just been said. But he did his duty. For their actions, this court sentences both defendants to 10 years in state prison, with no possibility of early release. May this serve not only as punishment, but as precedent. The gavel struck. And it echoed far beyond those walls. As the officers were led away, Collins cast one final look over his shoulder. Not at the judge. Not at his lawyer. But at Calvin. It wasn't a look of remorse. It was fear. Not of prison, but of a world that no longer accepted his kind of power. A world where people like Calvin Booker didn't ask for space. They took it. Outside, the air was different. No drums. No chants. Just quiet resolve. At the base of City Hall's steps, a new mural had gone up. Painted by local artists overnight, it showed Calvin standing firm, one hand holding his badge, the other shielding a young boy behind him. The words above him read: "Truth without action is just another speech." Calvin didn't pause to admire it. He walked past it, briefcase in hand, step steady. He had a city to rebuild. 3 weeks later, Glenridge was still transforming. Not through some sweeping miracle, but through the grit of a city forced to confront itself in the mirror Calvin Booker had unwillingly become. The daily rhythms of life resumed, kids caught school buses, construction dust filled downtown streets, and storefronts opened their doors, but something fundamental had shifted. People now looked their neighbors in the eye differently. Some with shame. Some with new respect. All with awareness. In the mayor's office on the 3rd floor of City Hall, Calvin sat at his desk, the morning sun washing across a pile of case files. A half-eaten breakfast sandwich rested on the corner. Rivera stood nearby, holding a thick folder. "Final personnel report from Internal Affairs," he said, laying it down. Calvin flipped it open. 27 officers recommended for termination. 12 resignations already filed. 6 commanders under independent review. And 1 department, finally, on the verge of accountability. Rivera hesitated before speaking again. "The press is waiting. Crowds are back outside." Calvin glanced toward the window, where voices murmured like distant thunder. "You sure you don't want backup up there?" Rivera asked. Calvin shook his head. "I stood alone when they knocked me down. I'll stand on my own to answer the people." Outside, the plaza was packed again, but it wasn't the same protest. This time, it was a town hall, open mic, no barriers, no bulletproof glass. Teachers stood beside teenagers. Retirees next to rookies in uniform. Some faces still bore skepticism. Others carried hope. Calvin stepped up to the podium, his presence quiet but commanding. "No cameras today. Just people." He raised the mic. "I never wanted to be a symbol," he began. "I just wanted to serve. But the moment they dragged me into that gravel, I stopped being just one man. The crowd was silent. I became a mirror for this city. And mirrors don't lie. They reflect. And sometimes, what they show you isn't easy to look at. He paused. I was beaten. My badge was burned. But I lived. And the question isn't how I survived it, it's what we're all willing to do now that we've seen it. A murmur moved through the crowd. Then hands lifted. One by one, citizens stood and spoke. A school janitor, I watched my son cry after seeing that video. But he stood taller after watching you stand up. A white police officer, voice low, I joined to protect, but I stayed silent too long. I'm ready to be part of the fix. A teen girl, holding her mother's hand, they tried to silence you, but you spoke for all of us. Calvin listened to each one. Not as a politician. But as a man who now knew exactly how much it cost to carry a community's hopes. After the forum ended, he stepped down from the podium. No fanfare. No handshakes for the cameras. Just quiet nods, and one little boy who reached out and pressed a sticker into Calvin's palm. It was small and wrinkled, but it said everything. Mayors matter too. Later that night, as he sat alone in his office, the city lights blinking outside, Calvin finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. He pulled a leather-bound journal from the drawer and flipped to a fresh page. He wrote. They hit me thinking they were stopping something. They didn't stop anything. They started a movement. And I'm not going anywhere. He closed the book. Then looked out the window, at a city still broken, still healing, but for the first time in a long while, trying. And that, more than justice, more than headlines, was the beginning of something real. What happened to Mayor Calvin Booker was more than an act of police brutality. It was a revelation, a spotlight on a broken system, and the courage it takes to confront it head-on. Sometimes the ones who break the silence aren't the loudest. They're just the ones who refuse to stay down. As Calvin said, you didn't fail to recognize authority. You failed to recognize humanity. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to True Echo for more stories that reveal truth through fiction, and fiction that feels like truth. Leave us a comment, what would you have done in Calvin's shoes? And share this video. Because somewhere, someone needs to see that silence isn't the end, it's the beginning of change.